I'm going to be telling a story that's an adaptation of the Irish folk song Finnegan's Wake. Yay! You might have heard it. Somewhat popular. Once upon a time, there lived a man by the name of Tim Finnegan. Born to a single mother in the green reaches of Ireland, Tim grew up and, as soon as he was able, left his hometown and his mother to go find himself, promising to come back with money to take care of her one day. Well, so infrequent was his correspondence and so short when it came that often it seemed like he would never return at all. However, his mother never doubted him. And indeed, eventually, 10 long years later, her prayers were answered and her patience rewarded as her son returned to her. He told her about how he'd searched the entire world to find his fortune, how he'd gone to every corner of the globe, even to Manchester. He had been rich and he had been poor, and while he was currently, regrettably, poor, he had learned enough on his travels to be able to get a job in town to support the two. Now, his mother, of course, knew that he was never going to bring back money, but she did believe that he had learned a lot on his travel. And she, of course, knew that he hadn't traveled quite as far as he claimed, but she did believe he probably had made it to Manchester. And so she welcomed him back in, kissed him on the head, and then immediately pushed him back out the door to find work. And so it was that Tim Finnegan found himself back in his childhood home, advertising his services as a bricklayer by shouting loudly about it while walking the town. Now it was in doing so that Tim Finnegan met Mr. Murphy, the town's senior bricklayer, and a senior man he was. Tim walked up to him, shaking his hand, laughing, saying, "Murphy, it is so good to see you again. I'm gunning for your job, you know. I hope you can handle the competition." The old man responded, I don't know if I would if I could. Not much life left in these old bones, you know. Say, I was actually on my way to a job just now. Old Mickey Maloney wants me to lay a bit of wall for him. Truth be told, I'd rather someone else did it. Mickey and I have been on uneasy terms these last years. He's a very, very demanding client. Well, what do you say? Are you up to the task? And Tim nodded eagerly. Now, bricklaying was not a skill that Tim had displayed any particular aptitude for or interest in prior to his travels, or during his travels, or after his travels. In truth, the only reason he had advertised his services as such was because he thought it a job too easy to fail. One must simply spread mortar and lay bricks. And so, thinking himself very clever for categorically underestimating an entire field of craftspeople, he got to the job site, and a while later finished his work with a truly impressive lack of quality, even for a beginner. He decided then to celebrate his dubious victory the same way he celebrated all of his victories, dubious and undubious, which was the same way he celebrated every night: whiskey. Now, the barkeep in this town was a man by the name of Patrick, and Patrick was Tim Finnegan's childhood friend. And so, when Tim walked into the bar, he was recognized immediately and welcomed in even before that. They laughed and clapped each other on the back, and they caught up in the way that only good friends can, with Patrick telling Tim about how he inherited the bar and all the problems that came with it. Tim telling Patrick every detail that he could remember about the city of Manchester. Until a young woman named Patty, who was the bar's serving maid, noted that Tim had run up quite a tab. Tim was embarrassed, but admitted that he had no money in his pocket. Patrick, being a good friend, decided that was no reason for Tim not to drink, and poured him another round. Now this visibly irritated Patty, who was about to give the barkeep an earful for serving his friends on credit, again, when Mickey Maloney barged into the bar. He had, of course, seen what Tim had generously referred to as work, and was going and demanded that Tim return as soon as possible to do the job again, but do it right this time. And Tim agreed and apologized, hat in hand, and eventually Mickey left the bar grumbling. at which point Tim nodded to his friend, promising to return, a promise he would keep early and often, and left. And as if it weren't enough that Tim had come to drink without any money in his pocket and had brought trouble with him when he came. He also left a proper mess of spilled drink in his wake, a mess which Patty, the serving maid, was left all by herself to clean again. Now, over the next several months, Tim actually learned a respectable amount about the craft of bricklaying. After all, he had an endless series of practice sessions of botching Mickey Maloney's job over and over again. He sought the tutelage of Master Murphy, the bricklayer, showing him every mistake that he perpetrated upon that poor wall. And Murphy, playing the wizened master, would teach him how to avoid those mistakes in the future on other people's jobs. In fact, by the time Mickey's wall looked almost as he'd originally intended for it to look, Tim looked almost like a bricklayer. And of course, with each new lesson, a new celebration with his friend Patrick at the bar, a celebration where Tim would never pay and always leave a mess. Until one fateful day, when Tim decided to celebrate prior to doing his work. Mickey Maloney stared out the window with contempt at Tim Finnegan until poor Tim slipped on his ladder and crashed to the ground head first. Mickey rushed out of the door looking for signs of life, but Tim lay there motionless on the ground. Cursing his luck, Mickey picked him up and began the long trek to the edge of town to Miss Finnegan's house, where he would deliver the bad news and her son's earthly remains. But gregarious a figure that Tim was, news of this accident traveled faster than Mickey Maloney could walk. And so, when he arrived, he saw there, prepared and ready, Finnegan's wake, along with almost everybody they knew. The air in that room was tense, but the body of the late Tim Finnegan was not the cause of that tension, but rather the prism through which it was focused. The entire town's collected animosities were gathered in this one room with Patrick, the barkeep, quarreling with Patty, the serving maid, over their shared livelihood. Mickey Maloney despising Murphy, the bricklayer, for never doing quite a good enough job. Indeed, everybody gathered there found present not only themselves, but some perceived rival. It was Patrick, the barkeep, who spoke first, throwing himself upon Tim's body and wailing about how he was an angel, a saint, a true soul, all things that made the unhappier among them roll their eyes and become more and more and more agitated. It was Patty, the serving maid, who struck first, figuratively speaking, when she walked up and told him he was none of those things and you know it. Patrick turned around to her and looked upset, betrayed, and she pressed, saying, "And I bet he's never even been to Manchester." And that's when Patty, the serving maid, struck first, literally speaking, when she brought fist to face against her employer. People threw punches, they kicked, they dropped elbows, and made an arena, sparking a brawl that the town would never forget, until Patrick, the barkeep, hucked an entire full bottle of whiskey at Mickey Maloney. He missed. Mickey was still spry, and it shattered upon the table upon which rested Tim Finnegan, soaking him from head to toe. And it was there, and it was then, in the presence of this saintly Miss Finnegan, who simply sat in her chair watching sadly, that a miracle occurred. For when that whiskey, that water of life, touched Tim Finnegan's lips, he sat stock straight up, looked around, and shouted, "Did you think I was dead?" The entire room went silent. Everyone looked at Tim Finnegan. Patty and Patrick looked at each other. Mickey and Murphy looked at each other. The entire town met each other's gaze in that room. And it was in that moment that they realized exactly how precious life really was, exactly how precious their lives really were, and how critically important it was that they treat each other with forgiveness and with grace. And as they left that house, battered, bruised, and better for it, above all, they realized that Tim Finnegan was a no-good troublemaker, and none of them would have anything to do with the fool ever again. Thank you.